Oh, was I not supposed to do that?
No. All right, this session ends now, and you can go ahead and get started.
Okay. So share my screen. Are we up?
I don't see your screen right now. Let's try.
We were seeing it, Cameron, and then you did something and it turned off.
Oh.
You're already sharing.
Oh my gosh, what did I do? Oh gosh, what did I do?
No, that's totally fine. Let me see if I can pull up your slides. Give me 1 second while you try to figure out on your end.
Oh, what did you do, Cameron? Show my screen.
Show your screen. There you go. Got it now.
It's up?
Up.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Y'all can still see it?
Yep.
Wonderful. All right. Afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our session today on best practices on solar planning and zoning for Minnesota communities. Now, can I advance? Yes, successfully advanced. Okay, we're in good hands. Good deal. All righty. So just an FYI, as you probably realize at this point, today's event will be recorded for future reference and use by those unable to attend today. My name is Cameron Bailey. I work at the Metropolitan Council as a senior planner and solar advisor. We have two other speakers today, Toya with the SolSmart Program and the Solar Foundation, and Brian of the Great Plains Institute. Just want to do a quick overview of our agenda for the day so you can prioritize your time and how you want to interface with today's content. So I'm kicking things off with an intro to today's programming, then Toya will give us an overview of the SolSmart program. After that, we'll hand things over to Brian to deliver the bulk of today's content with best practices in solar planning. And I'll round out the first half of our programming with the solar planning support available to our Minnesota communities. After we take a very nice 10-minute break, we'll hop back into solar community profiles where you'll tell me what solar information is the most use to you in your communities. And we'll end the day with a review of a couple case studies on solar planning, and then close things out with how to engage with the resources we cover and answer some questions from the audiences we have time. Advance, very good. Okay, and then on my end, great. Alrighty, so kicking things off. Here's a term I'm sure nearly all of you are aware of, comprehensive plan updates. So council staff, we've been reviewing and coding about 160 comprehensive plans between December 2018 and December 2020 for inclusion of or reference to solar energy, climate resilience, and sustainability elements. The most common topic discussed in these plans was renewable energy, and more specifically, solar energy. Many of the plans emphasize the importance of increasing community-wide use of renewable energy by protecting solar access through new ordinances or amendments to existing policies, things we'll be covering today. Additionally, these plans not only focus on installing solar on public facilities, but also engaging solar or encouraging solar installations on residential and commercial buildings. As such, we designed our technical support to meet that demand, which brings us to our webinar today. There we go. So Today's solar planning and zoning webinar is the third event actually in a larger series of solar technical education events we've been putting on this month through our partnership with the SolSmart Program and the Solar Foundation, the Great Plains Institute, and the Clean Energy Resource teams, as well as the Council. I'll touch more on those partnerships later on. These first two events you see, solar permitting and inspections, were also recorded and being made available to view online in the near future. Once they're all made available, we'll share out links to all of those in attendance today, as well as those attended previous events. You'll also notice down that bottom right, we have additional climate resilience webinars under the More to Come title. And so we haven't identified those dates yet, but just put it on your radar to look for those rolling out later this year. With that, I'll go ahead and hand things off to Toya to give us an overview of the SolSmart program, which was truly integral in making today and our previous workshops possible. Toya?
Thanks, Cameron. I will go ahead and take the ball. 1 second. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. So I've been tasked to give you a quick overview of the SolSmart program. So the program is a US DOE funded program. So at the beginning of every presentation, we just have to give this brief disclaimer that all the work that we're presenting today is supported by the US Department of Energy. So a few of you may know, or all of you may know what SolSmart is. It is a national designation program that provides technical assistance to local governments across the country. And our objective is to really help local governments streamline solar permitting, planning, and zoning inspection processes with the objective of reducing solar soft costs. So we want to be able to help your communities to reduce those barriers to solar development. All the technical assistance that we provide is provided to you at no cost, so it does not cost your community anything to participate in SolSmart. And hopefully at the end of the program, you have a landscape that is favorable to solar development. So really, we want to be able to help communities foster the growth of mature local solar markets. So in terms of the program itself, we work to help communities increase transparency. So one of the things that you will be asked to do if you haven't done that already as you're participating in SolSmart is to create a permitting online checklist, which really is a way to help applicants understand the process and for them to be able to know what it entails to receive a permit. Another thing we ask you to do is create a solar landing page, which is a repository of solar processes, or if your community provides incentives to solar, that would all be on your solar landing page. And then what we provide, like today, is training for planning staff on planning and zoning best practices for solar PV. We also provide permitting inspection training, and then we also work to reduce barriers. So one of the things that we do for all communities is we review your planning ordinance and identify if there are any intentional, unintentional barriers to solar development. We also work with your permitting departments to decrease your permitting turnaround time, and then also provide zoning language that you can adopt in your ordinances that states that solar PV is a by right accessory use in your ordinance in all major zones. So in terms of designation structure, we recently, last month, we updated the criteria. Now, if your communities have been working with the original criteria, that is totally fine. You do not need to work on the updated criteria. However, if you're starting off, you would then follow this updated criteria. Now we have 60 points, total points that are required in the bronze category. And we ask communities to have 20 points in the permitting inspection, 20 points in the planning and zoning, and then 20 points in the special focus categories. In total, there are about 8 prerequisites, 3 for bronze, 6 for silver, and then the 8 for the gold designation, and then 100 total points in the silver category, and then 200 points in the gold designation. Now, this is really quick overview. So your technical assistance provider will be able to explain this further in more detail than I am. So in terms of designation pathways, we have 3 major pathways. So the standard pathway is for municipalities that have jurisdiction over solar permitting, planning, and zoning and inspection. If you do not have jurisdiction over those processes, you can definitely sign up for our modified pathway. And then we also offer regional organization pathway for regional organizations to pursue SolSmart designation. And again, your technical assistance provider will will explain these processes, these pathways in more depth if you're eligible for one or the other. So in terms of our categories, we have 2 foundational categories, so permitting and inspection and planning and zoning. And then we have 3 special focus categories, government operations, community engagement, and market development. Now, these may be different for you because if you're still working on the original designation criteria, you might see something like utility engagement or solar rights. If you're still pursuing those credits, that's totally fine. But for the updated criteria, we actually reduced the categories into 3. So originally there were about 5, and now they are 3. And you know, the point totals vary from 5 to 10. That is still the case as well. So one of the things I would like to flag is our website. So if you're looking for more information, you can go to soulsmart.org. And if you're trying to understand what credits we currently have and how you can get those credits, I strongly suggest to look at our program guide. So once you go to soulsmart.org, there's an orange button that says Get Started. You just click that, and then you can go to the program guide that will explain different credits we have, and we have templates as well as community examples, so you can see what other communities have done to achieve those credits. We also have a really great resource page that has different resources, so we'll have our webinars there, our different issue briefs, and then additional training that you can use as you're pursuing SolSmart designation. And that is the end of my presentation, so I'll hand it over to Brian.
Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, and then if I fade out here on the auto, make sure that somebody tell me.
I will.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to kind of run down the best practices for planning and zoning for solar energy. I know that some of you on the webinar probably have seen some of this work before, but it's always good to go over it again. The Great Plains Institute, where I'm from, is a nonprofit organization. We have been around for about 20 years, and we do a lot of work on energy, kind of looking generally across decarbonizing the economy so that in order to benefit the economy and the environment. We have a number of different programs. I've done work a lot of work in the communities program, as well as we've recently started a new program specifically on renewable energy, where I'm heading that up. So the kind of agenda that I'm going to go through here is first to talk about why solar planning and zoning is important to communities, why this is kind of an issue for planners and local government staff to pay attention to. I'll go over what the principles of solar-ready communities are generally, some of which Toya's already covered, and then talk about solar planning and a few examples, and then focus a little bit more specifically on solar zoning and the model ordinance that Minnesota has that we just recently updated that talks both about small-scale kind of solar rooftop and accessory uses, as well as large scale and principal uses for solar. It's seen as those are two very different kinds of land uses. So why solar energy? Well, this has been something that has really transformed the energy world in the last few years. Solar energy, electric generation, is now competitive with other forms of energy generation, including kind of what had been the cheapest of natural gas. And between the two of them, wind and solar are actually the two cheapest forms of energy generation in the world. And as a consequence, we're seeing dramatic increases in both of those in terms of new additions to the energy system. With these ongoing cost decreases we expect to continue to see for solar energy, we actually expect it to surpass wind as the cheapest form of wholesale electric generation of any type within the next few years, and to be competitive at the retail level with pretty much any kind of cost structure that we're seeing anywhere in the nation. And these cost projections are not subsidized, but rather unsubsidized cost projections. As a consequence of those declines in energy cost, we're now seeing a lot of changes to the demand for solar energy, particularly at the wholesale level, where we're looking at things like large energy consumers that are demanding inexpensive and clean energy and are taking steps to acquire it. Kind of the article over there on the right of fairly recently about corporate investment in energy surging, where you have big companies not only putting things on their rooftop as shown here, but also buying and funding the entire solar and wind energy farms and buying the entire output from them. Electric utilities as well are transitioning to lower cost renewable energy because it's cheaper than the existing coal plants on their system. In Minnesota, both Xcel Energy and Minnesota Power, our two largest investor-owned utilities, have announced plans to basically be carbon-free by 2050 and to be substantially carbon-free by 2030. And so this is all going to happen through a variety of different forms of investment, but the primary new form of investment is going to be renewable energy and solar energy in particular in some cases. So as a result of that, solar resources that just a few years ago were largely irrelevant from planning purposes are now economic in virtually every single jurisdiction in Minnesota. And as a consequence, every county and city will have property owners who will want to develop their valuable economic resources on their property because they can actually generate energy more cheaply than they can buy it, or that they can sell it at a profit to a buyer. So this is something that is happening everywhere. It is not a flash in the pan. It is going to stay around. It is going to continue and accelerate. And as a consequence of that, communities really have an obligation to kind of look at this and plan for it on a forward-going basis, so that solar development happens in a way that is consistent with community priorities. Many of you have seen this graph about solar resources up on the in the upper left there, which is the kind of national graph that the National Renewable Energy Lab publishes, showing kind of the differences in solar resources across the country. And this graph always makes it look like a place like Minnesota actually has a really poor solar resource, right? If you want to do solar, you're going to do it down in the desert Southwest. That's where the real resource is. Except that this graph is a little bit deceptive. If you look at the graph in the lower right, that's somebody has taken this and modified it to kind of really give it a relative look. And you can see that from the desert Southwest up to Minnesota, there really isn't that much difference. It's about 70%. We get in Minnesota about 70% of what the desert Southwest does in terms of solar radiation. So on an annual basis, which means that it's not as cost effective perhaps as it is in the desert Southwest, but it still easily meets cost effectiveness tests because our solar resource is actually very good, as it is pretty much across the entire country. So we have a good solar resource in Minnesota. We have one that is cost effective and economic, and as a consequence of that, we really need to plan for it. So what does it mean to kind of be solar ready? Kind of looking at these solar ready or solar development options that we're seeing, and making sure our communities are ready for that kind of development. And there's 5 principles that we've talked about for a number of years here as what needs to happen. And these are largely consistent and matched within the categories that you see in the SolSmart program. And that is, we need to have comprehensive plans that really describe solar resources and encourage development of them. We need development regulations that explicitly identify solar development in its various forms and enable it to happen within kind of the priorities of the community. We need permitting processes that are predictable and transparent. And Toya was kind of talking about some of those in terms of what needs to happen in the SolSmart program for permitting. We need public sector investment so that the community itself in its governmental entities is making investments in their community solar resources for the benefit of the entire community. And we need local programs that limit market barriers and enable private sector development of solar energy in the same way that communities do things like economic development in their community. There's a recent article that you might have seen that came out of Planning Magazine, written by one of our Cameron's and I colleagues at NREL, Meakin Day. That is 7 steps, and this is to large-scale solar development, but a lot of the concept applies as well to small scale. It's really kind of what do you need to do. The step 1 is always laying the groundwork for doing your planning at the community level. And identifying comprehensive plans and development regulations and permitting processes that are going to help the community kind of move forward and make sure that this happens in an organized and consistent way with your community priorities. So let's talk a little bit specifically about planning and comprehensive planning. And Cameron's going to go over some of the kind of resources that the Met Council actually provides to communities to help with this initiative, and that were available actually in the last round of comprehensive planning, and many people on the call probably utilize those resources. But the first thing is to really for planning is to identify and define your solar resources. Solar resources you can think of as a geographically specific, quantifiable resource, just like other kinds of resources. We actually sometimes talk about solar resources as your community's solar reserve, like the same way you would talk about an oil reserve or a coal reserve. You can define it in the same way, you can measure it in the same way, and you can kind of see the economic value of it in the same way. Some of the work that the council has done can kind of help communities do that. You need to acknowledge solar development benefits and desired co-benefits in your plan, because there's obviously different kinds of solar development that occur, and there's different kinds of ways that it can actually benefit the community, both in terms of direct benefit as well as co-benefits, and such as making sure that your solar development is actually doing things like enhancing water quality or creating habitat where it makes some sense, or making sure that it's going to increase jobs in your community. You do need to identify solar development opportunities as well as conflicts in the community. There are good things that we advocate for in our plans, such as urban forest, our tree cover. That's a good thing. We also have rooftop solar. That's a good thing. They're 2 good things, but they don't fit well together, and your plan needs to kind of be cognizant about where those potential conflicts are and to set the groundwork for kind of resolving those. Another, for principal use solar, we have communities that have farmland protection ordinances. How does solar development in rural areas and on farmland fit within your farmland protection goals? Those are things you need to think through and kind of help make sense in your plan. And then finally, you want to set solar development targets or goals, just like you would for other kinds of development. When you do your comp plan or your housing plan, you're setting actual development goals of how to meet your community's needs and respond to the marketplace. Solar development is the same way. And I just wanted to give a couple of examples of that, solar development targets or goals. We have across the nation hundreds of cities that have set 100% clean or renewable energy goals in different ways. And we saw some of this done in the metropolitan area and in greater Minnesota as well, different kinds of targets that were incorporated into either comprehensive plans or climate action plans, such as a percentage of your total electric energy use that you want to be renewable or you want to be solar, a percentage of your total electric energy use that is to be generated in boundary. In other words, kind of how much development you want to see inside your city, and And we've seen a number of communities that have set, for instance, 10% goals of their total electric energy use is to be generated in boundary within their city. That's an achievable number pretty much in any city in Minnesota. A target number of solar installations within the city, or a target capacity of installed solar within the city. These are different ways that cities have actually set those targets in order to make some sense about what kind of development you want to see in your community. The example that I kind of wanted to really pull out, it was just recently done. This was in the last couple of months. The city of Des Moines, Iowa, has actually set the national gold standard for solar development targets or renewable energy targets by not only saying that they want to achieve 100% of their community-wide energy use from clean energy, carbon-free sources of energy, which is more than solar and wind, of course, but they actually want to achieve it. They want to make sure that it happens every day, every hour of the year, 24/7, 365. They want to always be using 100% renewable energy, not on average or not on average basis over the year, but every single hour of the year. There's been several corporations that have also used this standard, and this is kind of really where we're kind of going for these big aggressive targets that cities are setting. So that's kind of the planning concept about how you want to do a solar planning and why you want to incorporate it into your comprehensive plans. And we do talk about not only comprehensive plans, but also other kinds of plans you do. For instance, specific area plans. When you're doing a downtown plan or a corridor plan, how are you incorporating solar into that as well? You need to think that through, as well as functional plans, like climate action plans, or one example of a functional plan, or a housing plan, or even a transportation plan. How are you actually incorporating solar into that development? Because solar has a role to play in all those kinds of functional plans as well. But anyway, let's move to zoning now. So obviously, once you've set your plan, you have to implement it. And one of the ways we implement it is to put it into our development regulations at the community level. And this is really where the rubber hits the road in terms of a lot of things that happen in regard to development. And the 5 kind of points that we really want to make sure, the principles we want to hit on solar-ready zoning, include explicitly recognizing and addressing the different forms and uses of solar development. Just because it uses a solar panel doesn't mean it's the same land use, any more than a huge industrial facility and a backyard shed are the same things just because they're both buildings. There are different forms of land use, and you need to make sure that you're addressing those in the appropriate manner in your ordinances. You need to create a by right installation opportunity, particularly for rooftop solar. Make it clear, make it obvious, make it by right. Incorporate your standards into there so that the developers have an obvious and clear pathway to go by, the installers, when they go to people in your community and say, yes, we can do a solar installation on your roof. You need to set clear and predictable standards that balance solar resources with other resources and land uses. And I kind of mentioned this earlier: urban forest and rooftop solar, community scale or large scale solar and agricultural protection, historic resources, natural resources, things like airports. How do you balance these things, and where are there risks and where are there opportunities? You need to enable in your ordinance capture of desired local co-benefits. This is something where it comes particularly into play for large-scale solar, where you can say that we want to make sure that this solar development is going to actually enhance your water quality and meet your water quality goals. There are ways to do that in the development process, increasing or restoring habitat function. There's ways to do that in solar that it is difficult to do in other forms of development, but you can do in solar development, and we can provide some standards for that. And then finally, maintaining consistency with regional best practices. We want everybody to be using the same foundation for solar development in their zoning ordinance across jurisdictions, so that the market can work consistently across jurisdictions. We have, to help you with this, we have developed a Minnesota Solar Ordinance. It has been around for a number of years. We just updated it this last summer, so to kind of reflect new best practices and new developments in the solar industry. And you can see the document structure there along the side, where we talk about scope and purpose and definitions, accessory uses, principal uses, certain kinds of conditions and solar incentives that some of which are not zoning, but we put them in it and kind of give you an example of what to do. So I'm going to kind of go through some of this because this is the kind of thing that when you do your SolSmart review, you're going to take a look at and understand kind of how the different credits in SolSmart relate to your zoning ordinance. We want to make sure that we have definitions that make sense and are consistent with best practices. The best practice in particular here on your definition section is to make sure that we're defining solar energy systems broadly and to differentiating based on system area, really, not system capacity. The zoning ordinance ideally should not be talking about the limitations based upon a capacity, but rather upon the size. For instance, as you noted down there on community scale, it says in this case, a community scale system typically covered less than 20 acres. It doesn't say the number of megawatts. Acres is something that people understand. Megawatts is not always understandable. But you also need to define, I skipped over it, but the solar energy system in a way that defines it broadly so that it captures all the different kind of purposes that solar energy serves, including energy storage, which is now becoming more and more a component of an energy system, a solar energy system. Another kind of principle that we try to get to is to make sure that we're regulating the impact of the development, not the electrons. Some of the things we've seen in that first bullet point is to say that the solar energy system shall be designed only to provide energy for the property on which it's located. That's regulating the electrons, not the size. This is kind of a problem, and it creates problems for certain kinds of business models that we are seeing. Similarly, we have seen a size limited as it relates, and this is something that applies to accessory uses, where the solar energy system shall not be sized to provide more than 100% of on-site electric use. This is a problem because some properties will use a lot of energy, and a next door property that's almost identical will use a lot less energy. We don't want one size to have a large solar array and the other one to not have it. That is something that discourages energy efficiency, and that's a big mistake. So this is kind of one of those principles we want to make sure that you think about when you're designing your regulatory standards. And I want to go into now some of the specific small scale and accessory use solar definition or best practices. And here, this is a summary slide, which I'm not going to go through point by point because I'm going to go highlight some of these. But it does kind of talk about what the zoning best practices are for small scale solar within the SolSmart program. And you can, the things down the right are kind of the categories that we go to, including basic zoning functions such as height and use, as well as things like and setbacks, dimensional standards, as well as some things like various kinds of impacts and questions like glare that come up around solar energy. Height standards, as an example, the best practice in SolSmart is that roof-mounted solar energy systems on flat roofs, similar to other kind of functional devices and equipment, are exempted from height calculations. On flat roofs, you put a solar panel up. Sometimes it may exceed the height standard, but generally what you will see in a commercial energy district is that rooftop equipment is exempted from that, as you can see in this picture, there's this big thing called the chimney there. Those are typically exempted from height standards, and the reason for that is because the function of the equipment requires it to be above the building. And so it's something that is exempted from typically a height standard. And solar also needs to be obviously above the building in order to function the way it's designed. We have an example out of the Minnesota Model Ordinance where we specific some of the language we provided that for purposes of height measurement, solar energy systems and other other than building integrated systems shall be given an equivalent exemption to height standards as building mounted mechanical devices and equipment. And that's a clear kind of example about how you can actually make sure that your ordinance is internally consistent with other kinds of things. Setback requirements. This is something that comes into play for ground-mounted systems. The best practice is to allow ground-mounted solar energy systems the ability to have a modest encroachment into the setback area similar to other mechanical systems. And we provide some example language in the model ordinance down below for that as well. We have seen some communities that have allowed an encroachment by, instead of saying similar to mechanical systems, they actually put a number on it. They say you can go into it by a certain number of feet. That's another alternative. Lot coverage, and this is again something that addresses ground mount systems. The best practice is to exempt ground mounted systems from lot coverage or impervious surface calculation if the ground underneath the system is pervious, vegetated, and that which is important, especially from the impervious surface calculations. In the model ordinance, we have some language here that we've identified specifically around this, allowing ground mounted systems shall be exempt from lot coverage if the soil is underneath. It shall also not count toward accessory structure limitations. So if you only allow, for instance, 2 accessory structures on your lot, that you can still put up a solar ground mount system on the lot. And things like solar carports, which is a special kind of use, are exempt from lot cover limitations because they are sitting on a piece of impervious surface already in terms of a surface parking lot. Aesthetics, this is one of the big ones for rooftop systems. That the best practices are to exempt solar from rooftop equipment screening requirements. Don't restrict it in terms of visibility from public roadways, and to limit your screening or aesthetic standards to historic districts or other places where you have aesthetic standards. And sometimes that's, in a few communities, we actually see that's much of the community. They have aesthetic standards. And if you're going to regulate everything under those, you should regulating solar, of course, makes some sense, but don't apply an aesthetic regulation to solar that isn't that is unique to that district that you're in. And the Minnesota Model Ordinance provides some of that language here. To acknowledge that you want to design it to minimize visual impacts, but only to the extent that doing so does not affect the system cost or the efficacy of the system. And similarly, that solar on flat roofs. In this case, the language provides that it shall not be more than 5 feet above the finished roof in order to allow for some flexibility from the top of the finished roof and exempting it from screening requirements. Of course, in historic and special use districts, this is one of those places where we have some potential conflict between solar and other kinds of priorities. There should be guidance about how systems can be installed while preserving historic character. The U.S. Department of Interior, which manages the historic preservation programs nationally and designations, actually has developed criteria for you to refer to. And the language from our Minnesota Model Ordinance provides you some of that language and reference, as well as kind of local for those communities that have local designation to make it explicit to a developer or to an installer that you're going to have to get in a historic district approval from the community's Heritage Preservation Commission or equivalent. So now let's talk a little bit about, shift gears and talk about large scale and principal use solar, where there's a different kind of land use and has different kinds of standards. And one of the things I always pause here is to say that just because we apply certain standards to large scale uses does not mean that we should be applying it to the accessory use schedules. And I'd be happy to talk a little bit about that if people have questions. Again, we have a set of zoning best practices for large scale solar that we've developed that are consistent with the SolSmart program, defining terms, enabling development. Typically, it's not going to be an as of right development. It will be typically a conditional use, but making sure we're enabling it as a principal use in certain districts, making sure we're focusing on land use, not on energy use, as we kind of mentioned earlier, recognizing the different kind of land use differences from other kinds of development, making sure you're capturing co-benefits, you're doing things like screening and setback requirements in a way that makes sense for the actual potential risk or nuisance that is faced by the system, and addressing things like glare and decommissioning in a way that it still allows the development to proceed. So some of the kind of siting elements that we talk about in the model ordinance, and that this is kind of consistent with what the general principles are that we push for in the solar and SolSmart program, are to define different kinds of solar development. In Minnesota, we have two scales of solar development that we see. We have community scale and we have large scale. And I have in this ordinance defined it as fewer than 20 acres. We actually have some communities that have gone down to 10 acres. That's a kind of a solar garden size development, a 10-acre development in the Xcel Energy program. Large scale is typically going to be, I have here over 20 acres, but typically a large scale solar development is going to be much bigger than that. It will be in the hundreds of acres, or even, as we are now seeing, in the thousands of acres kind of development. Some of those are going to be exempt from local land use controls, but you could still put the reference into your ordinance to make sure that it provides guidance to the Public Utility Commission, which is going to be overseeing the environmental review and land use controls for anything more than 50 megawatts in Minnesota. The site design elements that we want to talk about here: setbacks, screening, the ground cover, things like power and communication lines and fencing are all things that we typically see in a large-scale solar ordinance. And we're going to provide a little bit of guidance on that. For instance, setbacks, you need to think about different kinds of setbacks. You obviously want a property line setback and how that works in the context of large-scale solar. Roadway setbacks, setbacks from specific land uses, and in particular, non-participating dwelling units. That's been a hot button issue. You need to make sure you set a reasonable setback from a non-participating dwelling unit. And then other features such as natural area, commercial areas, recreation areas, things like how do you, address it around things like airports, etc. So different kinds of setbacks, and we provide guidance in the model ordinance for this. As an example here, we have some language out of the model ordinance that talks about property line setback, a roadway setback, a housing setback from a non-participating landowner, and a setback distance from the edge of the, or how you measure the setback distance. Are you measuring it from the fence line, from the solar array itself, etc. And we recommend that you usually measure setback distances from the edge of the solar array in order to kind of, which is where the real impact, visual impact is for the system. And then to allow for a waiver of those setbacks if there is a landscape buffer. And this is kind of the guidance we see on the right here. This is we provide some guidance in the model ordinance to recognize that setbacks for solar farms are primarily there to address visual impacts. There are no noise impacts from a solar farm. There are no air emissions. There's no production of anything that's going to be coming and going from the site that you're going to be able to tell. They're largely completely quiet. They don't have other kinds of nuisances. They're primarily with the setback affecting visual impact, and which is the same impact you're mitigating with a screening requirement. And so those come into play together. An aggressive screening requirement should allow for a shorter setback. A longer setback should minimize the amount of screening. And so we do see occasionally some excessive setbacks that have been designed unique to solar uses. And we ask that the best practice is that you should make sure that your setback requirements are consistent with other kinds of similar land uses that have similar kinds of nuisances in your ordinance. Don't be arbitrary in your selection of solar and for the use of a large setback if you're not doing it for other kinds of uses. Screening, kind of similarly, use existing screening standards as your benchmark. If you don't require screening for other kinds of land uses, why are you requiring it for solar? If you are requiring screening for other kinds of land uses, look to that to first guide how you screen solar. Consider the screening circumstances. You don't need to screen put screening up between two agricultural parcels. There's no point in screening. It's a visual impact that you're screening. There's no sense in screening the solar farm from a cornfield. What is the relationship between screening and setbacks, as I said, and avoiding, again, arbitrary standards where everything else you're having a setback of 50 feet for, but in solar you're saying that's going to be 200 feet property line setback. Why are you doing that? What is the purpose of it? Kind of carefully consider that standard. Here's some kind of screening standards that we kind of come up with and some additional guidance on, and one of the things we recommend is actually that you ask for a landscaping plan that identifies this so that it can be kind of made consistent with your other kinds of screening that you require, and kind of some guidance there about best practices and when it should be used. Another point is ground cover, and this is something that's become particularly important for large-scale solar. On visual impacts, obviously your ground cover makes a difference. It has a big difference on water quality impacts, both surface and groundwater. In the case of agricultural lands, soil health, what you do with ground cover is very important in terms of kind of habitat function and even potential restoration and carbon sequestration opportunities that you have within solar. In the model ordinance, we actually recommend that you, for any large-scale principal use solar, that you actually have the site meet the Minnesota Beneficial Habitat Standard, which is a program administered by the Board of Water and Soil Resources specifically for solar farms. It's kind of described in the text on the right, and there's some kind of model language about how you would do that and kind of what the best practices are in Minnesota for both making sure that it's installed initially and then making sure that it is maintained over time. And that's really critical to really get all the benefit and capture the co-benefits of solar from the standpoint of water quality, habitat, and visual impact. I'm not going to go into them because I don't have time, but there are other principal use discussions that we have around things like airports, integration with stormwater systems, stormwater regulation, natural resources. We have some guidance about how you integrate large-scale solar with agriculture, and then some growth management kind of issues. And then, of course, decommissioning, which is something that most communities do put in for large-scale solar, and it makes some sense, and we have some guidance on that as well. We also include in the model ordinance some conditions for kind of special conditions for solar incentives. How do you integrate solar, for instance, into things like planned unit development? How do you develop solar-ready or solar actual conditions for special use permits? Solar access protections for solar or solar easements, kind of solar cross-property protections, and then kind of economic development assistance and desired solar outcomes. So that's kind of my summary of kind of the best practices for solar planning and zoning. And I think I'm passing it back to Cameron now. Or are we going to take questions, Cameron, on any of this?
Yeah, how about folk, for questions folk have, please use the chat and drop those in now. And I'll transition us into the next portion. And we can field some of those questions during the break, just so we make sure we're keeping things moving on schedule. Okay. So I'm going to try to not screw this up again. Okay, can I get a confirmation audibly that my screen is up and working?
Yes.
Beautiful, thank you, Brian. And big thanks for going over that big bulk of our presentation here today. Always really great content from you, much appreciated. And to make sure we get to break on time, I'm now going to cover the different forms of support that are available to our communities here in Minnesota. And I'm just framing this as our core support. So just as an FYI before going forward, as a SolSmart and a GreenStep community, you're able to receive unbiased, what I consider top of the shelf and Minnesota specific solar tech support from all of the entities we're going to touch on right here, and in a cost-free manner. There we go. Alrighty, so as Toya mentioned earlier, SolSmart is a national designation program with a national network of technical support and experts and aggregated. I mean, there's thousands of years of expertise from seemingly dissimilar and quite similar communities across the country. That map there on the left, Toya, correct me here, but I believe the initial goal of the program was 300 or 500 communities, and we passed that a couple of years ago. And so for every community that's designated in this program, that's also an increasingly large database of other communities working through asking the same questions in different combinations of overlapping and political, economic, natural resource, and historical contexts that we're able to pull from. Here in Minnesota, we currently have over 35 Minnesota communities designated in the program and over 50 enrolled. So you can see us there up at the top of the, well, I mean, you all know how to find Minnesota on the map, your planners. So moving us forward. There we go. Great Plains Institute, or GPI is the acronym you'll most commonly hear. They're based in Minneapolis, and they serve communities in climate planning consulting, energy planning, facilitation convening, renewable energy, all those things Brian touched on. And they serve communities across our region, our kind of bioregion in the upper Midwest, and 35 state total. So they're a national leader that's also Minnesota-based and Minnesota contextual, or context-specific. Then we have the Minnesota GreenStep Cities program, which is a voluntary challenge, assistance, and recognition program to help cities achieve their sustainability and quality of life goals by defining 29 best practices across 5 areas, those 5 you see on the screen. So buildings and lighting, land use, transportation, environmental management, and resilient economic and community development. And those should all look fairly familiar, especially in comp plans. So it's no accident that these are framed up in a way that also kind of parallel the ways by which we typically, as the planning profession in Minnesota, categorize how we're planning for our communities. Thus far, there's over 125 Minnesota municipal and tribal communities that have achieved some level of designation by this program. GPI partners with several state agencies, nonprofits, and League of Minnesota Cities on program development and implementation. One such nonprofit partner being the Clean Energy Resource Teams, or CERTs. And CERTs, their mission is to connect individuals and communities in Minnesota to the resources they need to identify and implement community-based clean energy projects. As you can see, they divide the state into regions to provide context-based services. Metro CERTs is the one you see there in the middle, which is probably relevant to most of our communities on the call today. And they actually serve the 11 county Twin Cities metro area. And they describe that service as being focused on empowering communities and their members to adopt energy conservation, energy efficiency, and renewable energy technologies and practices for their homes, businesses, and institutions. So again, a parallel there in how we usually classify our approaches to planning in our communities. And lastly, the Metropolitan Council, our regional planning agency. So we track and aggregate existing community solar ordinances, projects, and plans. So for those of you today who are like, oh, okay, it's on our work plan this year to update our solar ordinance or to draft one in the first place. What are our peer communities doing in the region, in the metro region? Those are the resources we have. So we can answer that with, well, here are the communities next to you are the ones you consider your peers. Here's what they're doing, and this is how they got to those decisions. We work with all of these wonderful partners to develop various solar permitting, inspections, and planning templates and models. And Brian touched on a few of those. Those absolutely inform the technical assistance we provide. We work with state agencies and universities to develop robust and up-to-date solar data and analysis that's relevant to our metro communities. And we foster regional learning and sharing of goals, knowledge, and experiences, very much in the vein of why we're doing this 3-part solar permitting, inspections, and planning series. There we go. So, solar planning support in Minnesota is cost-free, unbiased. It's what I like to say, top of the shelf, top of the line, and indeed Minnesota specific. All of these, I group these together because we really do and are very intentional in making sure we're aligning these resources so that if you reach out as a GreenStep Cities community and you're asking about something in solar, the council, CERTS, GPI, and SolSmart, we connect all those various resources to make sure we're really creating a context and environment in which the sum of the parts can be greater than the whole in terms of the resources you get, and making sure that like they're actually relevant and specific to what you as communities are wanting and needing. So that goes back to why we're tracking comprehensive plan updates. And I don't want to get too deep into that because that's really a big portion of our second half of our programming today. So at this point, oh, that's beautiful. We have about 5 minutes before we hop over to break to vet any questions folk have. Toya or Brian, y'all see anything in the chat?
Yeah, so there is a question about, so what are the most compelling arguments for a community to invest in the effort to achieve SolSmart designation versus operating on their own?
Would you like to touch that first, Toya, as a program manager of the program?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the, I mean, I would say the benefit that you're receiving is no cost technical assistance. Now we have a team of experts across the country. So to name a few, GPI, we also have NREL as a partner, and they're able to provide technical assistance aligned with solar industry best practices. So you're receiving a really well-rounded package of technical assistance on topics that are actually even emerging in the solar industry. Brian, did you want to add anything else?
Yeah, I'll say, well, you know, obviously, just the most compelling argument is that you get free technical assistance from people who've been doing this for a very long time. But the other thing that I would say is that you get the consistency across jurisdictions, kind of the idea that your ordinances have some, or your technical assistance of what you're doing is being consistent with what is happening regionally, and that you're actually capturing benefits that your community may not actually have thought of in terms of kind of the way that solar would work in your community. So we have seen a number of communities that have done things on their own, and then they have to go back and redo them because it didn't work, and we've all been through that already. So we can kind of help you avoid those kinds of mistakes.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Toya.
I was just also gonna add that you know, obviously this webinar today is geared around planning, but you're also getting technical assistance also on permitting and inspection. So really, it's a win-win situation.
Yeah, and
well, yeah, maybe Cameron, you were going to say this, but there's actually other elements of technical assistance you can get if you are, for instance, looking to install solar on your city hall or something, and you need someone to provide you some advice, third-party advice that from someone who's not trying to sell you something. You can also get that technical assistance.
Absolutely. So RFP assistance, if you're thinking of putting one out for your own facilities, site analysis for the solar radiance exposure, conversion efficiencies. What are examples of how solar has been installed in the Twin Cities metro region? So if you're curious about like, well, what would a ground mount system look like in a residential property? Via these partners here, we can actually point you to examples. Like this city has 3 of them installed. This other community actually has one at their city hall. So really, I think about us as a living database and network of partners. So kind of what you were leaning into as well, Brian, that collective group thought, we really facilitate that. So you're like, we're thinking about developing an ordinance. What have other people done? And what did they learn through that process as well, right? So if you can learn from someone else's mistakes and apply the lessons they learned without having to make them yourself, why wouldn't you, right? And so that's also part of how I think about the SolSmart program. Put in the work on the front end and aggregate lessons learned to share those out. So we have more of a level grounding of lessons learned, goals and aspirations for the future. And actually, like connect y'all as actual practitioners of the cities around the different considerations you're hearing from businesses, residents, solar developers, your utility. We have 11 different electric utilities across the 7-county metro region. So just in terms of also, aligning statutorily, what are your solar rights in the state of Minnesota? And when it comes to your specific electric utility, how do those fit together or not? And where is their flexibility and creativity? Want to make sure we don't go too long to make sure we get that break. But Brian or Toya, did y'all want to add anything else before we went to break?
No, I think you covered it.
Beautiful. Well, with that, big thanks, y'all. So 10 minutes. So I have 3:01 on my end. So how about everyone? Let's be back at 3:12, a very specific time, 3:12. And then we'll go ahead and bring things home from there. So thanks, everyone. Okay, we'll give it one more minute here. Then we'll go ahead and get back started. Okay, and we are at the very specific 312. Thank you everyone for making it back and sticking with us for the second half of our program today. And big thanks, Brian and Toya, again, for kicking us off right with the first half of our content. Just going to a couple quick updates. Remind folk this is being recorded. We will share out the video afterward, and the materials as well, as that's helpful for folk. Make sure we will share those also. For this next portion, we have about an hour, or I guess 45 minutes. Really strongly encourage folk to wake those fingers up, find the chat function on here. We're going to be practicing a little call and response as best as we can with the technology available to us. So I will be asking some questions and really hope at least a few of you will respond. It'll really enrich our experience here together this afternoon. So with that, we'll go ahead and get back into it. There we go. Alrighty, so solar community profiles, that's the next place we're focusing on. And solar community profiles are something we've been providing from the council for, I believe, about 3 years now, maybe 3.5 years now. And at a really high level, it's a consistent way by which we convey qualitative solar resource data to all of our metro region communities, so all cities, townships, and counties, and a way by which we convey consistently available quantitative solar resource data or solar energy production potential. And the idea there is that with more information that's available, the more nuanced, specific, targeted, and ideally successful planning we'll be able to do in and for our communities. And so this is what our community profiles have at a really high level looked like the last few years. For every community on our local planning handbook webpage, you have a profile like this, which conveys that qualitative data. So how is the solar distributed as a natural resource across the jurisdiction of my community? And we include water bodies in there, and where it's darker is typically where you have tree canopy coverage, and where it's lighter or brightest is where you typically don't have shading. So I think fairly straightforward. Where it's brighter, more sun; less bright, less sun. And this, it's a really high level map because that was really the granularity we were able to provide to every community across the metro. And then with that, we broke out these things that we called solar calculation numbers. So working from left to right here, we provided, for your community and just your community, what is the gross potential in terms of overall solar as a natural resource? As Brian said, what is your solar energy reserve in your community? And then if you were to just look at how much of that sunlight falls on existing rooftop structures, and full transparency, this was a snapshot from about 2010, 2011. So while a lot of communities do have new structures in their communities, vast majority of them don't have fewer rooftops than they had back in 2010. And then we translated that so that's the raw resource. How can we convert that? When that's converted to something called electricity, right, which we actually consume, what is bought, what is sold, what does that generation potential look like? And those numbers will look fairly similar, whether the decimal place just moved. So we utilize a 10% conversion efficiency. So of the solar as a natural resource that falls in your community, assuming 10% of it can actually be effectively converted to electricity, how much power would that be? And so that's what you see there on the right, or at the bottom right. So how much resource do I have and how much of it can be converted? And that's what we provided communities over the last few years across the metro. And really we were doing that in that ramp up to help communities prepare for their comprehensive plans and to really support the development of solar specific goals, policies, and strategies. So that was another component of what we provided in that last round of comprehensive planning was we're going to work from the top left to right and then down here. So solar goals by community type. So we worked with GPI and CERTs and GreenStep cities, and we drafted different solar goals that would be relevant to a more urbanized community in our metro, more suburban, agricultural, and rural community. And then we develop draft potential goals and solar specific goals by planning element. So if you're looking at solar as a goal, and as Brian said, and you're looking at the value add as being an economic value add, then how can we frame solar goals to relate to economic values and policies and goals within the community? Similarly, how can our solar goals support our housing policies and desired outcomes, our land use, and our overall resilience aspirations for our community? And then, to support a goal, you need policies and strategies. So we developed kind of nuanced solar development policies and strategies as potential policies and strategies for our metro communities, kind of breaking them out across accessory use solar development and principal use solar development. And that can include, when we put it out, it included things like rooftop, ground mount systems, building integrated systems, brownfield sites, ag land, greenfield. And you'll notice there's a couple I skipped over, such as parking canopies and photovoltaics or brownfield sites. And that's because just in that period of time, those have really emerged as truly feasible, possible, and actually deployed forms of solar development. So just kind of giving a snapshot here of the different types of land uses and plan elements that really can be applicable to most of our communities here in the metro. And now I'm going to jump into some of the newer information that we have available to us across our entire metro region as a way of informing how we should update these solar community profiles as, all of our communities are rolling into the implementation phase of their comprehensive planning, right? And re-engaging in that circular process of plan, implement, analyze, and then that re-informs how we plan again in our next cycle. And so one of my colleagues, Mauricio Leon, in our research arm, has been developing a regional greenhouse gas emissions tool for tracking and measuring our greenhouse gas emissions by each community in the metro, broken out by the categories you see at the top. And for our webinar today, energy is the specific one. And the data that's relevant there, we believe from a solar perspective, is we now have pretty consistent data across the metro for all of our communities for what is the annual energy use in our communities by land use. So across our residential land uses, what's our aggregates energy consumption across the city over the course of a whole year? What is our energy use by commercial land use, and so on and so forth. And then with that, we also are increasingly able to convey that energy consumption in terms of cost. So what was the cost in our community this past year for electricity consumption in our residential and our residential land uses and our institutional land uses, et cetera. And so that's something, vetting with you all today to see if that is indeed something that would be valuable and helpful to you as communities and rolling into that implementation phase to support your solar goals, policies, and strategies. at the council level, we've been, and spoke to this earlier, tracking and aggregating and logging what are the existing sustainability plans communities have been developing, climate action plans, energy specific plans. So again, you know, that person, whoever asked, you know, what's really the value add of doing a more group kind of cohort based technical assistance program versus going it alone? And I think this is another way of conveying that. So if you're interested in doing a sustainability plan with a focus on solar, we can let you know who all has already done that and how that's been playing out for them. And of course, as Brian pointed out, once you have a plan, you got to start putting mechanisms in to support that plan. So tracking the solar ordinances that are currently on the books across the metro region. And then also, you know, SolSmart really focused at its core on reducing red tape, which we can interpret as the less time we as staff have to spend on reviewing plans and the more knowledgeable we can be on what is a best practice for solar installation, permitting, inspections, the less time staff have to spend on reviewing those, and then the less money has to be spent. And thus we're reducing the costs of installing solar in our communities. And so we also track which communities have solar specific permitting and inspection forms and have a clarified process for solar permitting inspections. For some communities, that's just on the residential side, and increasingly for communities that's on the residential, the commercial, the smaller accessory, and increasingly even principal use ground mount solar systems. Alrighty, so bringing that all together, we have currently, we have draft solar goals, policies, and strategies that various communities kind of did a copy paste of. I think more communities adopted and amended to be more appropriate for your specific context and your community's wants and needs. Everyone has a solar resource map at this point. We have quantitative data now on our energy use and increasingly how many solar energy systems are currently installed in our communities. And then with Mauricio's tool, we're also able to increasingly project how will additional adoption of solar energy systems impact our energy use and our costs in our community. And so this is, you know, fleshing that out a bit. So communities, we can have solar goals, policies, strategies, permitting, inspections, forms, and processes. All things that all the partners we've spoken about today, we explicitly provide solar technical assistance on supporting those things. Solar resource maps, where we're updating those, we have more granular data, we're able to get building specific data now, so we're able to increasingly break out what is my solar resource in my community by land use type. And then to complement that, you know, again, how do we convey what the value add is for solar as a natural resource in our community? And so now we're considering layering on what is the current energy use in our community by land use, what are the current energy costs by land use in our community, and the greenhouse gas emissions in our community by land use as it relates specifically to electricity consumption. And then on that back end, if we have solar qualitative data and quantitative data, then we can also project in alignment with our solar goals, policies, and strategies in our communities, what is the potential energy production of solar installs in our communities, and what's the energy offset potential in our communities in terms of reducing costs that our businesses and homeowners and renters spend on living in our communities. And ultimately, or not ultimately, but another layer, how does that reduce our greenhouse gas emissions if that's an area where you have an explicit goal in your community and that's something that is valuable to your city council. And so this is a portion we're gonna not take a pause, but I'll more so take a pause and solicit you all to drop in the chat what other data would be helpful or most helpful to you and your community best plan for your community solar goals, policies, and strategies. You know, is that data a better or more clear kind of depository of existing solar ordinances, permitting inspection practices, existing solar PV systems that are already installed across the metro? Are you more interested in what are maybe some more nuanced solar goals, policies, and strategies for economic development or natural resource protection, economic resilience? So just ask everyone here to take, let's see, we have a little bit of time, maybe 2 or 3 minutes to just drop in the chat. One is the data that I just went over that we're planning on updating our profile maps with. Would that be useful to your community? And if not, what other sort of information would be useful in your community for your solar profiles? And I'll go ahead and drop that in the chat so everyone can read that. Alrighty, so I dropped those in the chat. So yeah, is the information we're planning on providing useful to your community? And what additional information would be helpful to your community in supporting your solar goals, policies, and strategies? And I'm not judging on grammar or capitalization. As long as I can glean what you mean, that works perfectly well enough. All right, we got some deep thinkers. No responses quite yet. Okay, there we go. Okay, great. Let's read that out loud. Yes, it would be helpful for our community. We currently don't have much planning happening around energy use or sustainability, but we'd like to get conversations going. So it sounds like this could be helpful for helping kick off those conversations. Brian, yeah, map locations and sizes of existing community solar gardens themselves. Okay, good deal. Alrighty. And it's been a few minutes, so we'll go ahead and keep it moving unless we got another one. Here we go. All right, for Burnsville, looking for information on how to implement projects, how to help entice private sector to participate with solar. Very good. Okay, I have a case study that might be relevant to that, which is good. A lot of larger scale solar is at the solar garden level based on state law and is related to Excel territory specifically. Might be helpful to see mapping or data related to where these are at and such. What expansion does our infrastructure allow for? Great. Some more utility engagement, utility planning, and how that impacts projected development and land use in one's community. They're starting to get in some really heady proximity to transmission and transmission capacity, which I love. But good to know that there's at least one person, Sean. All right, we can have that more in-depth, nuanced conversation with. Great. And folks can continue to use the chat. I'll go ahead and keep us moving at this point. And thanks for engaging on that, y'all. There we go. Okay. And so we're now moving into the home stretch. We have a few case studies, and then we'll do a little Q&A with the time we have left over on the back end. So assuming you have the information we discussed in these solar community profiles, how might that information inform solar planning and impact in your community? As the comment from Burnsville said, we're interested in how we support implementation, really incentivize it. So we will start off with Burnsville. Big fan of Burnsville. And just looking at a few of the things Burnsville has, and with each of these, we'll just pick up a couple of things. So Burnsville has a sustainability plan they just updated, which was I believe the last version came out, maybe that was 2009, 2010, and updated that, I believe, in 2019, between 2019 and 2020. And they have a few very specific solar or goals. So 7.5% on-site solar for residential and commercial by 2030. A goal of achieving 100% renewable energy for all electricity use for city-owned facilities by 2030. So specific number, specific land use, specific type of entity owning those assets, and the specific date, a timeline. Some of the strategy they have are moving electric supply of city-owned facilities to renewable energy, implementing the 2019 SolSmart Program's recommendations. So we review ordinances, we review current existing policies and practices within the community, and then when we review them, we provide recommendations grounded in best practices that are based in the experiences of other communities across the metro, the region, and country. Another goal of increasing participation in shared renewable energy, with a goal of achieving a 50% increase in the number of solar garden subscriptions within the city by 2025, and 100% increase by 2030 over 2019 numbers. So they clearly had a very intentional set of conversations and meetings to come to these very specific and explicit goals, which is really what we want here. And something else Burnsville's done, which I really love, and I just put one page from it, is they put together a residential solar design guideline. And it's something Brian said earlier. We don't just want to say what we don't want in our community. We want to think about how we want to define how we do want solar to show up and look like within our communities. And I love that there are a few examples here of the things Brian talked about. So making sure that all setback requirements are met, no more than 200 square feet in the area, no more than 15 feet high at maximum tilt, maintain the area below the system, for safety reasons. And then they give a few actual pictures of what they have in mind as being acceptable within their community in a residential context. I think it's just a phenomenal guide that they have in place that we absolutely link to at the council. They also have solar permitting and solar inspections forms and processes that are explicitly listed and laid out. So as a property owner in the residential or a commercial building, you can go on the City of Burnsville's webpage and find out, what do I need to do to get a permit to install a solar PV system? And I can have a sense of how long that'll take. And I have a sense of what will be the additional cost premium. That's also helpful for solar developers to have a sense of, if I'm going to work in this community, what are some of the costs I need to build into my proposal to install a system. There we go. City of Matamidi. I did not pronounce that city correctly when I first moved here, but I've become at least partially ingratiated, and I knock it out of the park every time now. So City of Matamidi, they also have a sustainability and energy action plan that they did through Xcel Energy's Partners and Energy Program. If that's something you're interested in or curious about, reach out to any of us on this call, and we'll connect you with certs who can give you more insight there. So similar to Burnsville, they have a plan in place and a couple of different types of plans. And with plans comes goals. And their goal clearly states that they want to achieve 30% reduction in energy related, so energy specific greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, and a 100% reduction or carbon neutrality by 2050. And some of the work they've done to help realize that goal is reducing barriers to solar installation in their community. And they've done that through a solar ordinance, which they already had on the books, and they had developed, I think that was maybe back in 2011, 2012. I believe GPI maybe even helped consult on how to build that ordinance, and they revisited it, right? Technology changes, pricing changes, markets change, as Brian pointed out. And so they enrolled in the SolSmart program, actually worked with all the partners on this page to review their ordinance, find out what are the best practices now, have a discussion with their sustainability commission, planning commission, city council, and do these best practices make sense to us? Are they applicable to our community? How do they align with and support our existing goals and other elements of our comprehensive plans? And then they clarified their solar permitting and inspections process. And so that's what we have here on the page, is just a snapshot of the things they lay out when we talk about these rooftop solar application checklists and processes, right? So saying what sort of permits you need, building and electrical, what sort of supporting plans you need, so construction detail and site plans, what sheets and other information you need to submit with it. So you should provide the specification sheets and install manuals that come with the system, and the proof of structural compliance and integrity. And there's a couple of different pathways we have in Minnesota that are codified by the Minnesota Department of Labor and Industry that don't always necessarily require an approved structural engineer PE stamp to be good to go. They give an idea of how long it'll take to turn around applications, 7 to 10 days. And then they clearly state what are the associated fees for putting a system together and install it on a typical residential property in their community. I just think Matamidi does phenomenal work, and for those of you who don't know Matamidi, up in the kind of northeastern metro near White Bear Lake, a really small community that is really out here leveraging all the resources available to them. And now I head to St. Louis Park, a slightly larger community, and St. Louis Park also has a climate action plan that has very explicit solar energy greenhouse gas emission goals. So a lot of them are pretty similar to the ones I read before in terms of tiered timelines for realizing milestones as a way of checking in for those longer term goals of 100% decarbonization within the city and different sectors, like in the residential, commercial, city operations, those things. Something really great St. Louis Park's been doing is they have sustainable building design standards, really incentivizing solar. And what really tipped me off that this was working is, I also do a lot of the reviews of environmental impact statements and EAWs as they come across our desk in the region. And I think I've seen 5 proposals in the last year where solar or green roofs or energy efficiency or passive solar were explicitly called out and integrated into the design of new buildings being constructed in the city of St. Louis Park, because they had a sustainable building design standard in place that really incentivizes those sorts of technologies that support those greenhouse gas emissions and climate action goals. Additionally, they have a city-specific rooftop solar resource map, and that's what we see here on the screen. St. Louis Park Solar Suitability Assessment. Sorry, one sec, little water. Oh, there we go. And so beyond offering a more granular layer of data as it pertains to solar as a natural resource on rooftop structures in the city, you also see at the bottom left, they also convey what are the different resources available to homeowners and businesses in terms of tax incentives and rebate programs. They also promote different group buy programs that smaller communities of people do across the metro. I mean, it's actually fairly common across the country. There we go. And then moving beyond that, we have 4 seemingly random communities: Brooklyn Park, Minnetonka, Maple Grove, and Roseville. Sounds like the setup to a really bad joke. They all walk into a bar. I'm terrible at telling jokes, so that's where that ends. So just have 4 headlines up here of how these communities are engaging in solar development in their communities on their municipal side of things with their city operations. So Brooklyn Park has one of the largest solar projects in the entire state, and that's actually their city facilities down there on the bottom left, where they have ground mount, pitched at different angles, and rooftop all on one site, directly adjacent to a minor arterial road and a residential community. You can see plenty of vegetation around, so kind of a really good case study in terms of what are different ways solar can be developed in the metro region and a suburban community. And so that's a great example of that. And there at the bottom right, that's over in the city of Maplewood at their community center. And Maplewood also has a couple ground mount systems just across there's a pond to the right of that picture, and the rest of the city operations are over there, where they also have ground mount systems. So also sharing out with y'all to show how cities are learning and developing their solar technical assistance by leading with their own site and facilities. And you also see by these headlines, they're also saving money in the process. So putting themselves in a really good position to be knowledgeable, to improve on their own solar practices within their community. And so just want to touch on a lot of the things those case studies have in common. They identified where solar energy sits as a value add, as a natural resource. Some are really framing it as an economic resilience value add, others as it's a way of like recruiting and signaling to new communities and businesses, like we're a community that cares about the natural environment, and this is how we're putting our money where our mouth is in terms of, you know, whether staff time or how they use bonding dollars or utilizing different municipal assets to help support the solar industry and reduce costs. Another quick drink, sorry. Alrighty, we also saw a lot of explicit goals for solar energy that are specific to that community, right? So talking about those 30% reductions or 30% increases in distributed rooftop solar on residential properties by this date. And those things really help set up that third one, where a lot of the technical assistance comes in that we've been talking about in terms of reviewing ordinances, or at least giving you a template to give you a sense of where is a good place to start in terms of reviewing different ordinance standards. And then having a sense of how are others permitting solar, how are they inspecting solar, what's been successful for them, what's proved difficult, what are the different ways in which folk are doing that. Moving down that list to also developing community-specific solar development resources, which is really what ordinances and permitting inspection practices are. And similar to what we were speaking of earlier, really leaning into that group thought. Well, what is everyone else doing, or what are communities doing that we really think of as similar to our context? And what are the resources they're providing, and what are the resources people are using, right? We don't want to put time and effort and energy into developing a resource that no one's using, which is also another reason why we're presenting this content today, and really hoping to solicit your feedback on what's helpful and relevant to your community. And then on that back end, you know, those last case studies that we just came out of, leading and learning by example. And you know, that's another thing. All those entities you see at the top right are core solar technical assistants in the metro. I think it's a way by which we really think of ourselves. We really try to make it easier and lower the costs, lower the barrier to entry, to helping communities lead and learn by example. So with the council, before they hired me, as a really cool collaborative position, originally with SolSmart, Great Plains Institute, McKnight Foundation, was the council facilitated the installation of some of the first community solar gardens in the state of Minnesota, and thus the country, at our wastewater treatment facilities. Now we have solar installed on our different Metro Transit bus barns and depots and parking garages and ramps, and we have community solar garden subscriptions. And that's allowed us to really learn by being leaders on that front, so we can pass on those lessons learned, and we can pass on some of the benefits we've been able to realize to our communities across the region. And so with that, there we go. That's the end of our content that we were presenting today. And at this point, I think I'll open it to Brian and Toya to see if there's anything else y'all wanted to add in terms of, or contribute in terms of how communities can move forward who are interested in some of this technical assistance. We can also hop into questions. I think I see we have a couple.
Yes, so if there are any communities that are interested, please reach out to Cameron, and Cameron, you can always forward those requests to me. I know that Brian's team will be working with this cohort, so we're definitely here to assist you in any way we can to pursue SolSmart designation.
Great. Brian, are you still on, Brian?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, quite well too.
Good.
Do you mind if I pitch one of these questions here to you?
Sure, go ahead.
Alrighty, so this looks like it's from Hans Lund, and Hans is asking, how can home or building energy audits help with solar initiatives? Do they help with, broadly resiliency goals?
Well, I would say that the answer to the second question is clearly yes, in that the anything that's going to diminish energy use or increase is something that is going to increase resiliency. Those are pretty inextricably linked. The solar initiatives. Sometimes energy audits don't address solar potential. Sometimes they do, and that's something that probably should be incorporated more routinely into energy audits. And because there's almost certainly at some point in any building's lifetime now, there will be an opportunity or an interest in installing solar, because it will be the cheapest form of electric energy generation that you can get, and it is already in most places cost competitive with retail electricity. So, kind of making sure that that's a component of solar assessment is part of your building audit would be a good thing to do. I will emphasize, however, that energy efficiency is always going to be the most cost-effective thing that you can do, and should and will have the greatest impact on your bill than anything else. And there's always things to be done in every single building in that regard.
That's awesome, Brian. Big thanks for that response. And I think that's a really good example of being unbiased. And I think that's usually a good litmus test, is when someone asks, should we invest in energy efficiency or solar first? Most solar professionals I know say, you do the efficiency first, and then do your auditing with solar as well. Another thing I see here is, can we get that guideline? I believe that's referring to Burnsville's kind of design guideline. That commenter said, right now our community is all about restrictions. Right. So yeah, how do we shift from just saying what we don't want to a better idea of what we do want in our communities? And I think that goes back to something else. Another commenter dropped in, which was having a better sense of where are the existing solar energy systems and what do they look like? Because it's really hard to imagine these systems, right, until like they're really there and in person, kind of like anything. It's hard to imagine something you've never seen before. And that can be really helpful too in terms of actually prompting really healthy and in-depth discussions within your communities in terms of, is this something that we think is acceptable in our community? And if not, what do we want or need to see so that it can be acceptable, especially if our residents of businesses are asking for them and already see the value add here. See if we have any other questions here. I'll make sure we got to everything, because we have time, we can. And folk can absolutely use the chat as well. Let's see. Oh, there may be one missed earlier on. Did we read this one? I think it'd be helpful for our community. I think it's going back to the solar profiles. We currently don't have much planning happening around energy use or sustainability in our community, but we like to get conversations going. Okay, so that's something that's great to know as well, that maybe the more ways in which we can convey potential value adds in the community, that makes it easier for you as planners to really help prime those conversations, especially if it's the first time in your community. So I'm hearing it's helpful for helping prime new conversations, re-engage in existing ones, as well as having more of a repository, maybe in a way, of existing solar energy systems across the metro. But when you're having those conversations for the first time, or re-engaging in them in the way Burnsville revisited their sustainability plan, you have more up-to-date information and examples of how and what solar can look like, and also make it easier to know who to call if you are curious about how that community experienced that system. That's great. All right, I think, or sorry, go ahead.
Cameron, I just wanted to kind of chime in on the kind of the question around don't have much planning happening around energy use in the community.
Yeah.
That's fairly typical. I just want to say that that a lot of communities see energy planning as being the realm of the state and the federal government, et cetera, because that's where it has traditionally happened. But it's actually critical now that local governments and communities think about energy, not only because there's more opportunity to do so in terms of sustainability, but actually because more and more of the solutions that we're talking about at the federal and state level actually are implemented at the local level. And so, and resources that we used to not worry about at the local level, things like solar, or if you get out a little bit away from the urban area, including wind, used to not be something that was that was that important because there wasn't much economic development potential, and now there is. And so it's really actually become critical on communities to include routinely energy planning in your kind of larger planning goals, in the same way that you would any other kind of new development opportunity. And the American Planning Association is coming out with new guidelines about this, and explicitly saying this. So I mean, this is not just Cameron and me, kind of pushing, but this is actually the National Association of Planners. It has recognized this and is advocating that energy planning become a routine part of local planning, and that planners need to come up to speed on that. And we're here to help.
Absolutely, thank you, Brian. I think that's a great plug. And just like truth, a good reality check. Yeah, so I think we could start shifting to closing and next steps for folks. So as Toya pointed out, if you're interested in help with facilitating a conversation in your community around energy planning and solar, CERTS is probably a really great entity for that, and you can reach out to Brian or myself to help with getting those conversations started. And I think CERTS is actually a bit unique too, in that they provide specific support to all sorts of entities. So they work specifically with school districts, farmers, small businesses, universities, across the list. Whereas us at the council, we're our legislative mandate is to really work with communities first and foremost. So we're really here to support city planning staff, county, municipal, increasingly interestingly, watershed districts, which is really fun, as we're seeing that those co-benefits, and Brian knows about this, between ground-mounted solar PV systems and even roof-mounted PV systems being combined with green infrastructure. So green roofs being combined with solar PV systems, bio-solar systems, and community solar gardens being combined with pollinator gardens, I think is something that's really become prevalent and nationally known about Minnesota and our community solar garden programs. So data as well. Council has that, we're really focused on providing data that's applicable to all communities in the metro, and granular to the community scale. If you're more curious and more of a site plan or analysis or a deeper data dive into more of a small area plan, then that's where having that SolSmart and GreenStep cities program enrollment and designation is really helpful, because then then you can get that more site-specific, community-specific solar technical assistance from the Great Plains Institute, GreenStep cities, as well as CERTs. And then with SolSmart, they're phenomenal as well. Some of you may have heard about the Minnesota Brightfields Initiative. We have 11 really large closed landfills in the metro with a robust solar energy potential. And one of our first SolSmart communities, City of Hopkins, they have about a 10-acre one, and they're like, hey, is that something we can develop? And I said, great question. No idea. Never heard of that before. And so SolSmart's the first place I went to and asked, like, is this a thing? And it turns out there's over 300 closed landfill sites and many more just general brownfield sites where communities have installed solar because really solar energy systems are they're interim systems, right? They're designed for a 20, 25-year life cycle, and then it's quite easy to decommission and remove those systems if at the end of their life, you want to use the property owner or maybe of the city, you're interested in prioritizing and elevating a different use of that land in the future. So just an example of how SolSmart as a community or as a program helps support local initiatives, and how all these programs are really been designed in Minnesota to be interrelated and to meet the needs of communities. So the more we hear from y'all about what you're thinking, what you're wanting, what you're confused on, the more we can cater our technical assistance to your needs. And yeah, I think that's it at this point. Beyond, we'll share out resources we went over today. Please email myself and Brian if there's like specific resources we mentioned that you'd like to get a hold of. And we'll be doing a follow-up here in probably about a week and a half once we are able to clean and edit everything up and get that out. Beyond that, any last words, Brian or Toya?
No, I think you covered it really well.
Thanks, Cameron.
Pleasure. Many thanks, you two, and many thanks you all who showed up today. For those in Minnesota, hopefully you can get out and enjoy these last couple hours of sunlight. Who knows, next time we'll see the sun. So with that, big thanks everyone, and take care.